putting this together, your passion around this, the tireless energy in trying to coordinate something like this, find support for it, and to make people aware of it is really, really something that I feel very humbled that you have taken upon, and I'm grateful to have this opportunity to speak with all of you, and thank all of those that are listening and those that are going to be watching this at a later time, and also the sponsors. I'm going to try to share my screen here if I can. We will find out quickly if this works. And I have a lot that I want to cover today, and I'm hoping we. Oh, it's probably here. Okay, so you're still seeing my slides, right? So I got a message. Okay, we're going to cover a lot today in a very short amount of time, and this is truly important. But we also want to have a chance at the end for you to ask questions or provide comments that might be very helpful for others to hear. So I'm going to go through all of this very quickly. Always can follow up, but we're going to start by talking a little bit about the history between religion and suicide, very briefly on mental health and suicide, what that connection is, go through some numbers and data for you, not a lot, but enough to give you some grounding and some foundation in this, tell you about what we know about suicide and suicide prevention. I'm going to then do a very quick jump into how to do suicide prevention, the tools and tips, what to do, how to ask the right question, what you're listening for, how to respond and follow up to somebody you might think or might be worried about, they might be at risk. We're going to end by talking about grief after suicide and the pain and loss, as you heard the rabbi talk about, and then mention just a few ways for anybody to get involved in this. So let's just get started with the history behind this, because there is a long history between suicide and religion. The ancient Greek legends depicted suicide really as good and admirable, as opposed to the Stoics and the Epicureans considered it an acceptable solution to intolerable life situations. You can see how we start seeing things change over time. When it's great and admirable, then it's only about some particular part of life. The Greeks and Romans condemned suicide as a political offense to the state. They made it a political issue. During the Middle Ages, there was a lot of mystery and superstition around suicide. For example, they used to say that if a woman walked through a cemetery and she happened to walk over the grave of someone who had died by suicide, she would be barren and never be able to give birth. Or some believed that if she gave birth, that the child would have an illness throughout its entire life. There was a lot of mystery and superstition around suicide. But things continued to change and evolve, and by the 19th century, with advances in medicine and science and understanding, beliefs about suicide began to change. Most religions now believe that you must have grave matter, something very significant happening to us with our full knowledge and deliberate consent to do something to yourself that would be considered wrong or grave sin. Individuals must have sufficient reflection and full consent of the will, actually. And what happens is that goes away when you have a mental illness. You really can't have full consent of the will. Your brain doesn't allow you to be able to do that as it gets sicker and sicker. The current status in most religions that we know of is that there's compassion, understanding, there's no judgments or condemnation around this. Now, it still exists. We know it. We know it in all faiths that it still exists, and we know some of the old teachings, but we know that things have changed over time. Among the major Jewish congregations, the predominant views regarding suicide are really no different in law or tradition than what has historically been taught. It really comes out of Deuteronomy. You can actually have a piece out of Genesis too, but in Deuteronomy, it makes clear what it says, that I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day, and I have set before thee life and death, blessing and cursing, therefore choose life. Basically, in the Jewish tradition, as you all know, or most of you will know, is that suicide is not something that is supposed to happen. It shouldn't happen. It goes against everything we believe in. It goes in everything that we've been taught. Judaism teaches us that we are born, how we are born and how we die is all in God's hands. Life belongs to God. Even our death belongs to God. And it's not the individual. It's life is supposed to be treasured, and we're supposed to take care of our life and preserve our life and live it for God. Our definition of suicide requires intent, full wits, non-deficiency in behavior. Taking your own life is viewed as a very serious violation of your responsibility to God and to society and to our Jewish community. This is why it's so important that we understand this and continue to evolve this in understanding that though somebody might be struggling, their mental health might be impacting their ability to function and make good decisions, we can still pay tribute to them and honor them, even if they have died by suicide. Now, Jewish people have long been instrumental in shaping modern psychology and psychiatry. Many of you know that Sigmund Freud was Jewish himself. However, the Jewish community has not always really been very comfortable in talking about mental health issues, and definitely still not about suicide. Mental health references in Judaism are long and historic. Saul suffered from bouts of depression. Hannah struggled with infertility. Isaac suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder after the sacrifice. Ruth, the wife of Naomi's son, when both women lost their husbands, they grieved together. This is where we're going to end today, is on the grief and the compassion that's needed. So we see mental health issues filtered throughout the Jewish history, and we know that suicide has been filtered throughout Jewish history. This is why we need to start with mental health. So let me give you some basic information about mental health. Mental health, psychological health, emotional well-being, however you want to term this, is predominant in our world. 43 million Americans live with a mental health illness at any one time in America, and that's just in America alone. Mental health starts in the brain, but it affects our entire body. It affects how we think, how we act, our behaviors, what we can do and what we can't do. Mental health affects all of us, and it is just as important as physical health. Mental health should not be treated any differently than heart disease, cancer, diabetes, anything else. It starts in the brain, but affects all of us. Mental health can come from a lot of different places, whether it's biology or chemistry in the brain, circuitry in the brain. Brain structure can change whether or not somebody struggles with a mental health issue. Life experiences such as exposure to trauma, old trauma, recent trauma, any kind of abuse can lead to a mental health issue. In a family history, we do know that mental health seems to pass on generation to generation. We also know that historical trauma, not just for the Native Americans and the African Americans, but we also know relative to the Holocaust, we know that some of that trauma passes on generation to generation in terms of mental health issues. In terms of the numbers, 1 in 5 will experience mental illness at some point in their lifetime. 1 in 25, about 10 million Americans, have a serious and persistent mental illness. These are chronic, long-term, major depressive disorder, schizophrenia, anxiety disorders that go on and on for people. Half of these illnesses begin very early on in life. By teenage years, we see half of them already developing, and 10 million Americans, at least that we know of, have a co-occurring mental health and substance abuse or chemical health issue at the same time. Now, as a foundational piece, we know that goes into suicide. So let's talk a little bit about what suicide is and what we know about suicide. That's why we're here today. We can't ignore the mental health because it underlies all of this. Suicide by the numbers is staggering. There's over 800,000 people a year that die by suicide around the world. That's more than all the wars that are going on. We are losing that many people to suicide every year, 1 death every 40 seconds. The last year that we have data for, about 46,000 Americans died by suicide. That's more deaths than homicides. That's more deaths than breast cancer. That's more deaths than DWIs. It's 1 death every 11 minutes. Let's just breathe on that for a moment. 1 every 11 minutes in this country is dying by suicide. We know that there are a lot of people that attempt. 1.1 million attempts every single year. That's 1 every 27 seconds. Every 27 seconds. Now, most of those people that attempt suicide are young people. Most of the adults that die by suicide, they die on the first time that they attempt and they die, especially true for seniors, but young people tend to attempt a lot. Males are more likely to die by suicide than females, about 3 times as often. You can see the numbers there, 36,000 out of that 46,000 were males. When we break it down a little bit by racial background, you can see in this country, it is primarily Caucasian Americans. 40 out of the 46,000 were Caucasian, but we do see it across different populations, African Americans, Hispanics, Asia Pacific, Native Americans. What we don't really know about is the LGBTQ population. We have no data anywhere. It's not tracked yet on death certificates, how many of that population are actually dying by suicide. We know they attempt suicide more and they think about suicide more, but we don't know whether or not they die more. How people are dying in this country, about half the time is by firearms. Suffocation and hanging is second. Poisoning is the third leading cause of death. But in this country, about half die by firearms. Around the world, the leading method of death is actually by ingestion of pesticides. It's really different around the world than where you are, where we see people dying. A little bit closer to home, in Ohio, it's the second leading cause of death for 10 to 14-year-olds. Third leading cause of death, 15 to 20-year-olds. Third for 25 to 34-year-olds, and the fourth for 35 to 54-year-olds. 1,600 people in Ohio died by suicide. Just to give you some idea of how people are dying, what you're looking here on this box are really the green boxes. The green boxes are suicides, the red boxes are homicides, and the blue boxes are accidents, unintentional injury. But as you can see here, across the lifespan, we see suicide occurring far greater rates than other types of death. You can see, the reason I put this slide in here is just to show you that over time, if we look at 2011 to 2020, we do see increases, we see some decreases. The most recent decrease came when COVID hit in 2020, and we'll see the data from 2021 should actually be down as well. However, tragically, we're starting to see 2022 already going back up where it was and will likely be higher. But you can see here, suicide fluctuates over time. We don't see it go and then all of a sudden there's a spike where it doubles. So you can see here 1,500 deaths. You don't see it go to 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 deaths. That's really important because the media would have us believe that there's all these epidemics of suicide and all of these problems. Yes, it is a public health issue and it's been going on for a long time. However, we know that it's relatively stable with increases, and that means we have to do something about it so that we don't see those spikes happening. So what do we know about suicide? Well, suicide is incredibly complex. Often we hear that there was one thing that led to a suicide, and it's never that. There's always multiple things that go into every suicide. Talking about suicide doesn't lead somebody down that path. It doesn't increase the risk of somebody dying by suicide. In fact, when I go through how to ask about it, I'll share with you that it actually reduces somebody's risk of dying by suicide if we talk about this. If we can treat people, if we can get people to help early enough, we can prevent not only suicide, but we can prevent mental illnesses actually from getting a lot worse. We do know that ambivalence is part of suicide prevention. The more we can identify this ambivalence, this sense of whether or not somebody should live or die, we can actually catch somebody before we tragically might lose them. This is a slide, and everybody will take different things out of all of these slides that I show this morning. This is a slide that I show in virtually every presentation I do, even when I train medical professionals on how to talk to somebody who's at risk for suicide. This is the clearest way for me to show you that mental health issues are real. These are real issues in the brain. If you look at the left picture, they're under normal. You can see lots of colors and lots of colors all over the brain. That's showing you lots of brain activity happening. On the right side, you see depression. And you can actually see how it impacts. Depression as a disease impacts the brain. No different than other diseases. And one of the reasons I want to show you this is because if you're talking with somebody that lives with depression, or anxiety or bipolar disorder or obsessive compulsive disorder, whatever the disease is, I want you to be able to think back to this slide and look at that person and know that that's a real person in there. It's a real person living with an illness that's changing their brain. They're not doing this because they want to. They're not looking for attention. The brain is really changing when somebody's got a mental health issue. We know that 90% of the time, there's a mental health issue connected with suicide. That's why I started with mental health, because we know if we don't address mental health issues, we don't identify them, we're going to miss out on catching them before it's too late. People that are doing well in life aren't dying by suicide. People that are struggling with mental health challenges, doesn't matter what the diagnosis is, those are the ones that we have to really be concerned about. Now, most of the people that have a mental illness won't ever go on to die by suicide. In fact, they won't even think about suicide. Just to give you some idea, depression is the most commonly thought of mental illness. There are about 20 million known, that's identified, diagnosed cases of depression in adults in our country every year, 20 million. Out of the 46,000 people that died by suicide, about 23,000 of them had depression. About 23,000. That means the others had some other diagnosis. The odds ratio of dying by suicide because of depression is about 900 to 1. Most people with depression live and function and they don't think about or die by suicide. Some do. We know there's a connection. It's why we have to talk about both mental health as it connects to suicide. Some things to know about suicide. There's not one typical person that dies by suicide. We can't say it's just depression or it's just bipolar disorder. We can't say it's just children because it's also adults. We can't say it's just males because females die as well. We know there's not one typical person. All people can be subject to suicide. There's not one absolute reason for suicide. Again, as I said, many people think, and the news will report that somebody lost their job. That's why they died by suicide. Or they found out their spouse was having an affair. That's why they died by suicide. Or they reached their house was being foreclosed on. It's never just one thing. It's always multifaceted. It starts with a mental health issue. We might add in a financial problem, an educational problem, a job problem, a relationship problem. We might add in all of those things. That's as the risk goes up. But it's never, ever just one thing. And there's this sense of ambivalence that seems to exist up until the moment of death. One of the easiest ways for me to share how this happens is the brain plays tricks on us as we get closer and closer to death and as the brain gets sicker and sicker. So it'll say, if this happens in my life, I won't take my life. Or if this doesn't happen in my life, I'm going to take my life. So there's a story about a young man who we lost to suicide, and he left a note. And most people don't leave notes. Only about 20 or 25% of people leave notes. He left a note. And in his note, what he said is, I'm going to take my life today. Here's what I'm going to do. And he said, but if one person smiles at me, I won't do it. Now, tragically, we lost this young man. But let me tell you the other part of the note. The note said, I'm going to take my life. This is what I'm going to do. If one person smiles at me, I won't do it. I'm going to smile at every person I see. Now, if I leave you with that story today and I say after this presentation, the rest of today, smile at everybody. Smile at every person you see, whether you even talk to them or not, because you don't know the pain that they're in. Smile, just because it might save their life. I would venture a guess that we all would smile at that person. But you see, we don't base our life on a smile. That is what happens when an illness takes over. We base it on something that might or might not happen. It's this place of ambivalence. It's questioning about value and reason in life, where we have an opportunity to save someone. And the last bullet point here is hard for people to understand. We know that most people who die by suicide, they don't really want to die. Death isn't really what they're looking for. They want out of the pain. Now, for those of you that have been impacted by suicide, my heart goes out to you. My organization is there to help you. I've lost many people. I've lost 6 patients of mine to suicide. I lost a family member to suicide, a good friend to suicide. I know it changes us. But it's not about their wanting to die. It's about them wanting to be out of the pain they're in, the unbearable pain and anguish that they're in. The person that's suicidal feels their life is in crisis. It's completely out of control. They see suicide as a solution to the pain, not a choice. It's an old myth that's been around for years. Suicide thinking becomes very irrational. Logic seems to escape the brain. It can't figure out a way to tell us what's going on, and it can't figure out a way out of the pain. Things become very illogical and irrational. And in the end, impulsivity and anxiety overwhelms the person. It takes over such that they can't do the things they need to do to get us the information we need to help them to prevent a tragedy. This is why the earlier we can identify struggles that are starting, the sooner we can do something to prevent a tragedy. Some things that we know about suicide, risk factors. There's lots of risk factors. You could Google risk factors for suicide and you'd see thousands of them. We do know that there are things that put you at greater risk of dying by suicide. But for example, being a male puts you at greater risk. That doesn't help us a lot. We know family history of mental health issues and a family history of suicide puts you at greater risk, but it doesn't tell us everything we need to know. The greatest risk factor for suicide is a prior attempt. Anybody who's attempted suicide is at far greater risk of subsequently dying by suicide, in particular, within a couple of months of an attempt. But we know there's a lot of things that put us at risk, and those are important to know. It's also, and actually probably more important, we know protective factors. Protective factors are the buffers. These are the things that prevent somebody from going down that path. Connectedness, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later in terms of what can happen in the faith community. But the more connected we are, the family, friends, work, faith, community, any sense of belonging, the more we're protected against dying by suicide. The more life skills that we have. How do we get through difficult situations? How do we problem solve? How do we communicate? How do we argue and disagree? How do we cope and adapt to different situations? Build that sense of resilience. The more of these things we have, that we can tap into when we most need it, in varying circumstances, the better off we're going to be. And when we have access to healthcare, good quality healthcare, and I'm not talking about just medical healthcare, mental healthcare. When we have access to that professional healthcare that can help us sort through our problems, we actually can protect somebody against suicide. I said there's a lot of different things that you may take from today. One is that picture of the brain slide. This is another one that I hope that maybe you can embed in your head as you think about suicide prevention. These are the warning signs, the research-based warning signs for suicide. And in particular, I'm going to zero in on those two that are in red for us today. These are the things that when we look back in psychological autopsies, those people who've died by suicide, and we've gone back to try to understand what happened. This is what's happened to 100% of those people we lost. Somehow they communicated their intent, their intent of wanting to die or to kill themselves. They communicated that. Now, often it's not very direct. They don't come out and say, I'm going to go and kill myself tomorrow and here at this time in this way. They don't do it that way. What they say is, I'm just a real burden to my family or my team at work, or everybody would be better off if I just left for a while. You see, we don't see those as a warning sign. We don't put it all together with all these puzzle pieces together and say that that's a sign that we really need to pay attention to. And yet we know most of the people communicate their intent to die. And the second, behavioral signs. People who are intent on dying look for a way to die. They might look for a firearm, some way to hurt themselves, a place in their home, something they can take to die. You might research online how to find out how to take their life. But these are the things that we really want to look for as warning signs. Yes, we want to know if somebody might be at risk, but it's these warning signs that are really important. Now, let me give you kind of one layer, just a little bit deeper. Some of these other things that we see here are really important warning signs to pay attention to, because about 60 to 70% of the people do these things. They talk about feeling hopeless. There's no hope for them. There's no hope for the future. There's no reason or no purpose left for me in the world. They might talk about being trapped, that they're in this unbearable pain. And often they will actually use that phrase, unbearable pain. People talk about pain a lot, and there's lots of ways of describing pain. If you hear somebody using that phrase, I'm in unbearable pain, that's a cue to you that we have somebody that might be at risk of suicide. So we want to pay attention to a couple of these things. Communication of, I don't want to be alive any longer, and looking for a way to die with some of these other, a little more subtle clues. I'm hopeless, there's no future for me, there's no purpose any longer, and I'm trapped. I'm trapped by life, and I'm in this horrible, unbearable pain. Those are the things to pay attention to, mostly. Now, we do know that there's mood changes. These often go along with depression or bipolar disorder, extreme mood swings, acting anxious and with anxiety and agitation. You want to pay attention to finding out if somebody's acting out of character. If they're acting unusual to what you know them to be, pay attention to that. Oftentimes, I have families that will call me, they'll come to our office after they've lost someone, and they'll say, I had a gut feeling last night, something wasn't right. I had a gut feeling before they left for work today, something wasn't right. Trust your gut. If your gut is telling you something isn't right about how they are, we need to do something about it. And we know that treatment works. Treatment makes a difference. The earlier we can identify somebody at risk, not just of suicide, but risk of a mental health issue, and get them into treatment, whether it's the hospital, it's outpatient setting, treatment for substance abuse, any kind of treatment that's available, we have a much better chance at saving lives. Now, that's a big foundation piece here. You know, we talked a little bit about mental health, and we talked about how much it happens. We talked about suicide and how much that happens to everybody. And we talked about how it starts in the brain. But where's the hope? The hope here is that we can actually identify somebody and get them the help that they need before it's too late. So I want to run through with you very quickly a process that we've created called Ask, Listen, Respond, and Follow Up. This is how you actually can do this work. Tips on what you can actually do if you find somebody that might be at risk or somebody tells you that. The first step is about asking. Now, there's two components to asking about this. The first part is, if you don't really know if they're suicidal, you might have any idea. Nobody's told you anything about it, but something isn't right. Maybe it's just that they seem down and out, the mood is not right, they're more anxious than they normally are, and you just want to start a conversation. Here's how you can start that conversation. Again, this isn't about suicide. This is just about how you doing. You haven't seemed like yourself lately. Is there anything going on? I know you, something's going on. Let's talk about it. I'm worried about you. Are you okay? Key thing here, this is two parts. First part is you are feeding back to them something that you're observing. And the second part is saying, I'm here and I want to do something. What can I do? So again, just starting an open-ended conversation, give them some feedback on what you're observing. You don't seem like yourself. Things, you seem kind of down, you seem kind of off. What's going on? How can I help? That's how we would start a very basic conversation. However, on the flip side of that is if you really are worried about somebody who might be at risk of suicide. Maybe somebody's told you, or they maybe saw something on a computer screen, they found a note. Okay, now you know you might have somebody who really might be. This is a different kind of question. When asking about suicide, we have to ask very, very directly. We have to use specific words, and those words have to have a fatality component to it. You're going to die. You just don't want to live any longer. Do you want to kill yourself? Are you thinking about suicide? However you can get the fatality component out, that's what's key here. You see, at the end of the continuum of being well to being ill to being near death, at near death, that brain is only thinking two things. I'm in unbearable pain and anguish, and death is my only way out of the pain. That's all it's thinking. So if we just ask them, you don't seem like yourself today, you seem kind of down, that's way further up on the continuum. We must ask a fatality component. And again, the research tells us this isn't going to lead them down the path. It's not going to make them want to die sooner. In fact, the research around the world tells us it reduces their level of anxiety. It reduces their level of stress. It connects their brain finally with an external source that says, wait a minute, somebody gets it. Maybe there's some hope for me. So the first question, very broad and open-ended, give some feedback. If it's about suicide, ask very directly. Now, what do you do then? You've got to listen. It's really important to listen for certain things. Do they have any hope? Do they have any reason for living? Do they have hope that treatment could work for them? Maybe they could get some help from medications or from a therapist. Have they ever been in therapy before? Did it work? Maybe it could work again. Maybe they haven't, but maybe we can tell them how it works for other people. Do they have specific reasons against death or dying? What connections do they have to community, to faith, to family, to support systems? Do they have any thoughts about the future? Did they not want to miss a graduation or a marriage or a birth of a child? Maybe it's a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah. We want to find out, are they thinking about any of these things? If none of those things are present, they're at greater risk. If we have some of these things, we can talk with them and engage with them in a conversation and keep them going. We do want to make sure that we don't want to minimize or discount their pain. Their pain is their pain. No matter how bad it is, no matter how bad it sounds, maybe it doesn't sound really bad to you, but for them, it is 100 on a 1 to 100 scale. And you might think of it as a 50, for them it's 100. We need to let them have their pain at that level. We don't want to argue with them or challenge them. We don't want to preach to them or prophesize to them about what may or may not happen. We don't want to make any promises about what's going to work or not going to work. We want to listen. We want to be engaged. We want to keep them talking. The longer we can do that, the more we can de-escalate them. And as we do that, we're going to respond. When responding, we want to offer help and support. The reason for this is that most people, when they're struggling with thoughts of suicide, they don't see options. They don't see alternatives. They don't think anything can work anymore. They can't find the ability to find resources. So when you can provide that, you are helping prevent them from going down that path. So we want to offer them help. How can I help you? You're not alone. I'm here for you. We'll get through this together. I may not be a therapist, but I can get you to somebody that can help you. Here's some numbers you can call. Here's a phone number to the National Lifeline. Here's a number to the crisis text line. I'll give you that a little bit later too. We want to keep the conversation going, acknowledge their pain, and then we want to follow up with, we know that following up is really important because most of the time when people start taking their medicines or going to therapy, they don't continue with it. This is a study of young people who died by suicide. And most of them had a psychiatric diagnosis, and a third of them were prescribed medication, but none of them had it in their system at the time of their death. So part of following up with somebody and staying connected to them is asking them, how's therapy going? Are you taking your medicines? Are you having any side effects? Just engaging that conversation helps people get through these really difficult times. We want to keep them away from loneliness and despair. So engage them, check in with them once a day, once a week, a couple times a week, text them, go see them, do a video call with them, whatever you can do to stay connected to them. Meet them at their home, go out for coffee, schedule a time, and then do it in between as well. So they don't just pull everything together for that one particular moment. Following up is really, really important. Here's some of those resources that you can give to them. National Lifeline, the crisis text line. All they have to do is text SAVE 741-741, and they can have 24 hours a day somebody anonymously texting a conversation with them. This is a local crisis service. There are resources. You want to let people know that resources exist. Okay, so now with all of that, I need to, at the very end here, switch to grief. And this is a hard piece. This is for when after a tragedy has occurred. We know suicide grief is different. These are people that have been impacted by a loss, by suicide, and there are millions and millions of us out there in this country. There's more than 5 million. 1 in 65 Americans are suicide loss survivors, and they are everywhere. They are in our families, they are in our communities, they are in sports and hobbies activities, and they're in our places of worship. Suicide grief is very different than other types of grief. Most of the time people do it alone because people are too afraid and the stigma is so great they won't talk to them. Most of the time suicide occurs in a home, and then people are stuck there. They can't get out of that home. So trying to figure out how to make meaning and continue on with life is very different when it comes to suicide. When it comes to suicide, they're mostly discovered by somebody in their family. Sometimes they have used something that was in their family for a long period of time. Sometimes it's a gun, sometimes it's pills for another medication. All of these things make suicide very different. And we grieve differently as people. No two people ever grieve the same way. But our past, how we saw our parents grieve, how we learned about grief, what's happened to us as we've experienced life experiences, what our relationship was with the person who died, other things going on in our life at a time. If we're overly stressed at work, or maybe burned out at work, and then we lose someone, our grief is magnified. Our family background changes us. The role the person played in our life, were they distant to us? Was it somebody we knew as a child or in college? Or is it somebody that's in our life every day? All of these things change how we grieve. And there's physical reactions to grief, obviously headaches and migraine headaches and stomach aches, sleep problems, all of our physical life gets interrupted. People are afraid to go to sleep because they're afraid of dreaming about somebody they lost. And if they're in a dream, they don't want to wake up, and then they get really angry after they've woken up because they want to be back in that dream with the person. We often have people talk about forgetting that they're actually gone and start talking to them. And then when they realize that they're gone, it's very difficult for them. These are common grief responses. Now, there's some similarities between other types of loss and suicide. In suicide grief, it's very unexpected. Even if somebody knows that they've been struggling with thoughts of suicide, it's still, when it finally happens, it's very unexpected. There's lots of unfinished, unresolved issues. There's anger. You get angry at somebody for dying and for not calling you and not reaching out. And it's very hard to get angry at somebody who's passed away. It's typically very violent in nature. And it alters mourning rituals, burial rituals. How we grieve changes when it comes to suicide. The relationship that we had with the person also makes a big difference. A parent who loses a child, we're never supposed to lose a child. People feel very stigmatized. People don't want to talk to other parents when they've lost a child to suicide. There's a lot of guilt around that. It's not normal to bury your child. What did you do wrong is the question they fear. Spouse who loses another spouse, they think that nobody will ever want to be in a relationship with them ever again, that they might have done something to cause that. The child who loses a parent feels like it's their fault that their parent left them. For a sibling, they're considered forgotten mourners. They have mixed feelings on what's happening. They're angry, they're sad, their relationship with their parents change, their relationship with the other siblings change, they move up and change in birth order. Therapists and providers, they have a confidence issue, a confidence and competence issue, they have ethics issue, they fear legal issues when they lose somebody to suicide. You see, all of these things change when it comes to a death by suicide. How do you help somebody who's lost someone? Give them permission to grieve, allow them to talk, just be with them. Sometimes they just need somebody to be there. Don't say things to them like, you're young, you'll be able to go on, you'll have another job, you'll have another relationship, you'll have more children. That's really hard for somebody who's just lost somebody to suicide. Know some things about suicide to help them understand and put it in perspective so they don't feel so alone. We want them to feel connected to resources and that there are others that have lost someone too. Be okay knowing that some of this takes a long time. The grieving process for suicide isn't a typical 1 year and then move on. Most of the time it's about listening, not being judgmental, knowing that resources exist, and that you're okay if they want to cry with you. Now, let me just end today. I know I've talked a lot. I want to get to some questions and comments here. But the rabbi asked me, how can a congregation get involved in some of this? I've gone through a lot of information very quickly, and there is much more to do if we want to prevent tragedies from happening in our community. We can teach about historical figures from the Torah. We can hold an annual day of hope where we bring together and we teach young people, where do you find hope and how do you talk about hope? How do you give hope? We can ask a member of the congregation to speak about their mental health issues, their challenges, their recovery, what it took for them, their ups and downs with it. We can hold a mental health and wellness fair. Always want to put in that wellness piece so that it doesn't have so much stigma and we can actually give some hope in there. We could conduct a suicide prevention training for staff. And it's not only the training that could help them identify who might be at risk among the students, among the congregation, but maybe another staff member who's really struggling. We could talk openly about Mental Health Awareness Month in May, World Suicide Prevention Day is September 10th every year. Be open about these things. We can promote connectedness. The more we can talk about how we're connected to each other, to our congregation, to our community, to our family, to our history, and we don't lose those things. Those connections mean everything. They bring us together. That helps. We can encourage congregation members to seek help. We can find professionals that are built, that are value-driven, they're value-based professionals. Find those that we're aligned with. Connect our congregation members to them. Be available and open to helping and supporting others. Don't put this aside. This is real. And that's not true just for a crisis situation where somebody is really struggling with thoughts of suicide, but it's in those grief situations as well. And not just in the month or 2 months after a burial. It's a year after, at the anniversary of their death. It's 2 years later when their child isn't going through graduation or a bar bat mitzvah, when all their peers are having a bar bat mitzvah. You can organize an event. We have all kinds of events. You don't have to do one of ours, just do an event. Walks and runs are popular. We have a bike ride. We have motorcycle rides. We have fashion shows and wine tastings and fun food events. We have all kinds of events. Do something that's fun to take this fear out of mental health and suicide prevention. In the words of the prophet Isaiah, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be discouraged, for I am your God. I will encourage you, I will also help you, and I will support you with my righteous hand. This is hope. This is a message of hope for us. We don't have to be afraid of this. We shouldn't go away from this. We need to go into this. Serious depression and mental health issues aren't moral failures. They're not characterological. They shouldn't be filled with stigma. These are illnesses that are dangerous, can lead to tragedies if they're not treated. But if we do this right, we can save people's lives. With that, I will say, now Rabbah, thank you very much. And I am going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to turn it back over to the rabbi.
Dan, thank you very much for a really meaningful presentation and very detailed. Lots of really helpful information. I'm wondering whether maybe some of those slides you might be willing to share for us to pass around to those who are on here, because they went by quickly, and I know that people would like to be able to remember some of those statistics, some of those tips that you gave about ways to identify, ways to support, the phone numbers and contacts and organizations. So maybe if you're willing to share some of that afterward, but it was really a very meaningful session. And it is, on the one hand, very startling to me to hear the numbers. I know I experienced it as a rabbi, and I know my colleagues online do as well, that suicide is a very real problem in our country, in our community. But to see those numbers in Ohio, to see that suicide is the #2 cause of death for young children, the #3 cause of death for older children, young adults, the #4 cause of death for older adults is startling to me, really startling, and a real wake-up call that this is something that we have to deal with and that we have to address in a meaningful fashion. And what was very meaningful to me in your presentation was that you made it clear that there are things that we can do, right? That we need to engage and be active. It's not something just to talk about, to worry about, but there are concrete steps that we can take, both to help individuals connect and overcome any suicidal thoughts, and also to support families who go through it. I hope that this presentation is a wake-up call for all of us, and it's a call to arms, so to speak, for us as a congregation to get more deeply involved in this issue. I want to throw the floor open for questions, and what I'd like to do as I do that, with everyone's permission, is that if you have a question, I would like you to raise your hand. You can either raise it the old-fashioned way, if you like, on the screen, or for those who are familiar with how to do it, at the bottom of your screen, there's a series of menu buttons. One of them says reactions. And if you click on reactions, you'll see many choices. One of them at the bottom of those choices is raise hand. You can click that to raise your hand. And then when I call on you, I am going to turn off the recording for your question. And then I will turn the recording back on, Dr. Reidenberg, before you begin. And Dr. Reidenberg will ask you to repeat the question. So the recording will pick up what that question was, but we can keep people anonymous during the discussion. So having said that, and with everyone's agreement and assistance with that. And I'm going to go back to gallery view so I can see everybody here. And we'll throw the floor open to any questions or comments that people may have.
So the question really is how do you respond when we don't really know if it was a suicide? There are many things that might have happened. For example, if somebody maybe got into a car accident, we don't know if it was in fact a suicide or not. And there are cases of drug overdoses, and we're not sure if the people really intended to die or not. So the question is how many of those other cases are there out there, and how do you live with that? Well, we estimate that for all the numbers that we know about suicide, about 20 to 25% is an underreporting. So we know that about 25% more people who have died of something that's not coded by medical examiners as suicide are deaths by suicide. So it's a lot of people that are dying from other means and not getting classified as a suicide. I think what's really important in terms of how do we live with that and react with that, respond to that, is to be able to grieve that they're gone. Grieve the person and not the way in which they died. And it's true whether it's a coded and actual known suicide or not. We don't want to remember somebody based on how they died. What was the method and what happened in that death? We want to grieve the loss of that life and that soul and what it meant to us in our world. The question about whether or not it was suicide is true even when we know it's a suicide. And what do I mean by that is that we have a lot of people that it's very clear that it was a suicide and they don't believe it. Most often this happens with law enforcement, where somebody's cleaning their gun and the gun goes off and the wife says he never would have died by suicide. And yet we are actually able to find out and prove that it was actually suicide. But there's this belief that it's not. That doesn't help us anymore when it's known to be a death or when it's unknown. We want to grieve the loss of the life and the soul and the person that was here with us. We want to remember them and honor them and pay tribute to them, not for how they died, but that further they're gone and what they gave to the world.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Dr. Reidenberg.
So one of the things that I am most often asked is the why question. Why did this happen? Why didn't we see this coming? And what do I do now? And probably the next biggest question I get asked is this question. What do I say? What do I say to somebody who just lost someone to suicide? There is never an easy answer to it. Some people say, well, tell them that you're sorry. You're sorry for their loss, because you are sorry for their loss. Some people say, look, you will be okay. Because we do want them to have a future and believe in a future. So we want them to know that they will be okay. But for many people, that's very hard. They struggle with whether or not you're being honest or sincere, or you're just trying to kind of gloss over the pain that they're in. So my answer to this question of what do I say is actually less about what you say. It is about what you do. And what you did, or what anybody can do, by offering to be there, offering support, offering reminders, offering to listen, is worth far more than what you can say. We know that oftentimes suicide survivors, those that have lost someone, it feels so ashamed and so filled with stigma that nobody will listen to them and nobody will want to bring up that person's name again, that they feel alone and isolated from the world. Neighbors won't talk to neighbors anymore because they're afraid, should I ever even ask about the person that they lost? It's less about what you say, it's more about what you do. You can offer your time, your support, your memories. You are going to go further than anything you could ever say to somebody. And we know, I know this as a survivor myself. I know this as somebody who works with survivors every day of my life. The more you can just be there and be available for them and not be afraid to bring up that person's name again, That's the one thing the survivor most wants, is months down the road, years down the road, for their loved one not to be forgotten. So if you want to say something that you remember about their loved one. But really, it's about being there and being available for them with whatever they need when they need it.
All right. There's a question that was put into the chat that I'll share now on behalf of the asker. How do we support young people away at school? I have 3 friends who lost children in college and have had no notice that there was a problem.
It's how do we support young people in school, and how do we support people when there was no apparent warning signs and it was a shock to the system? We need to make sure that we're available to them to listen to their grief and their response. We know that young people tend to be pretty resilient and they can get through these things actually far better than adults can. So we need to support them and listen to them, let them grieve, let them be sad, let them be angry, let them question and wonder things. We also need to let them be able to laugh again and to be able to go out and do things that they want to do and allow that period of time. We want to identify whether or not they might be at risk, however. Sometimes, excuse me, sometimes they start stumbling and spiraling downwards. We need to be able to identify if they're getting some of the warning signs or if depression is setting in for them. If they're isolating more, if they're withdrawing more from activities and from family, from the faith community, we want to identify those as being a little bit higher risk, and we need to intervene and ask them some more questions. We need to do some more education with them. We need to make sure that they know what the warning signs are. So that they can see them. Again, because we know that warning signs tend to be displayed, it's just not always very direct. We want to give them tools. We want to give them information so that they don't feel so caught off guard in the future. Finally, the most important thing is to make sure that they know it's not their fault. Young people will, just like a child who loses a parent, think it's their fault that the parent is gone. We need to make sure that they know that their friend is passed from suicide, that it wasn't their fault. They didn't have anything to do with it, and that if they could have done anything, that they would have done that for their friend. So those are some of the things we can do to help support young people.
Thank you.
So one of the really difficult things is, how do you help somebody who doesn't seem to want help or doesn't think that there is help for them available, and they feel like there's no hope anymore? This is a challenging situation, and it's not just true for parents, it's true for friends as well, for colleagues. What we try to tell people is that there's always hope. There's always hope until there's no hope because somebody has died. So up until that moment, there's always hope that a new medicine can come about, that a new form of treatment can come about, that a new connection can be made, that a new opportunity can arise. We know that there's always hope. We never know until the person is really right there that we've lost them. So it's really important to communicate to somebody who doesn't feel like there's hope, that you can see the hope. You have to be that hope for them because they literally can't find it. So anyway, you can say there's people out there that will listen. There's places you can go to. There's things that you can do. There are people that have been in your position and gotten through it, that you can remind them that they can too. They may not feel it, think it, or believe it right now, but you do. You have to be that external connection to hope for them. So take the hope that you have and give that to them. That's the most important thing. Now, I'll just give you a little teaser tip here. When they're really struggling with that and you can't find a way to communicate to them, say to them, look, let's you and I sit down here right together. You and I are going to do this. We're going to put your pain over here. We're going to put it outside of us for a moment. We're going to just let that pain be over here. We'll go back to it, but for one moment, it's going to be over here. And you and I are going to work on this together. Now, in doing that, if they can put that pain aside for one moment, you give them an opportunity to see what life is like without that pain. So that's how you help somebody find hope when they don't feel like there is any hope out there, and when they feel like no treatment's going to work, nothing they've done is tried is going to make any difference, you can give them something new. Anything new can give them that one moment of briefness that they need from that pain to get through that moment. Yes. So thank you for these couple of questions. The first is that the first question was really about, do we focus on tomorrow, or do we focus on today? When somebody says, I can't get through this, I don't know how to get through another day, what can we say to them? And yes, you can say tomorrow. We often say to somebody that tomorrow is going to be a different day. It will be different tomorrow. Now, they may come back to you and say, well, tomorrow could be worse. Well, it could be, but it's different than today. You want to focus in for them on something not being what it is right now, because right now is what's the worst. And if you can get them through the worst, something different, anything different, or even get them to see that something can change, we give them an opportunity. And the truth is that we know that if you can get them through to tomorrow, tomorrow isn't probably going to be quite as bad as today was. So yes, you can offer them up that tomorrow will be different. Now, the second question was about grief generally, and how do we address grief, and that life does go on. Because the truth is that life does go on for us. A part of us seems to stop as we grieve generally, or about suicide, but life does go on. The example that was shared was a picture online of a bicycle, and a tree grew up around a bicycle, and you could still see the bicycle there. Many people talk about this in terms of a scar. You can get a scar, and the scar can still be there, and you can still see it. It becomes part of who you are. And grief is very much similar. It can be a scar in your heart. It can be a scar on your soul. It can be a scar on your body. If you were anywhere near anything that was dangerous, that hurt you, and it's still now part of who you are. And when I think about grieving and helping people understand grief, I want them to incorporate it as a part of who their life is now. We don't want them to forget about the person that passed away. Let me tell you a quick story here. A good friend of mine, we grew up together from the time we were a year old until we were in college together. And I'll never forget the last time I saw him at college, and he walked away, and just a few days later, he had died by suicide. His name is on the other side of my wall, where you see some of my plaques there. His name is on our memorial wall. And his name is Billy. Billy Belzer is his name. And when I told his father that I wanted to start a memorial in his name, his father said, "Thank you. I really appreciate that you want to do that for Billy." He wouldn't even say my son. He said, I appreciate you want to do that for Billy. He said, but I don't want to ever know about it. He said, I don't want to ever speak my son's name again. I don't want to hear about my son. I'm glad that you're doing this for him and that he had this role in your life, but it's not for me. So we have to let people know that how they grieve and what they grieve and how they do this is up to them. But life does continue on, even for Billy's dad, who's still alive. And I've talked to his brother many times since, 20 some years ago now. Everybody grieves differently. So we need to let them have that scar, be whatever that scar is, and however they can deal with that scar. And yet, yes, remind them that life does go on. The sun will come up tomorrow. There will be more storms ahead. The winter will go away, but the pain will change over time. And last, let me just say about grief. People often say to me, is it okay to say to somebody that time heals all wounds? You can say whatever you want to people that are grieving and that are loss survivors. Here's what I tell anybody about that phrase, time heals all wounds. Time, for me, does not heal all wounds. Time passes and things change. But time in and of itself hasn't healed the scars that I have from those that I've lost. Time passes and time changes things, but it doesn't necessarily heal all wounds. So the other part of the question about tomorrow is you're not gonna do this today. We're here. We're right now. We're gonna get through this today. Tomorrow might be another day, and maybe tomorrow's gonna be worse. Maybe tomorrow you will hurt yourself, but it's not gonna be today. Is that safe, and is that okay to say? Um, I wouldn't say it's all that safe, because the brain of somebody who's suicidal will pick up on anything that's going to get them out of that pain. And if out of that pain means tomorrow's my day to die, then I can get through today, and then I'm gonna find my way through today because I know tomorrow's my day to die. So I probably would not be in favor of that. I understand the meaning and the intent and the thinking behind it, but for the suicidal mind, there used to be an old myth that people died by suicide more in the spring. They were depressed all winter, but all of a sudden, when the sun came out and they made a decision that they could die, that they were all of a sudden happy. And people didn't understand. All of a sudden, they seemed happier, brighter. They laughed, they talked more, and then all of a sudden, they're gone. We do know that the brain of those who are struggling with thoughts of death and dying, anytime they can connect it with being out of that pain, leads them to that pain. So I would maybe try to avoid that one. But unless that next day is they're going to be in a hospital where they're not going to be able to have access to it themselves, I'd probably try to avoid that. But good question. So first, let me express my sympathy for your loss. As I said, any suicide loss changes us and changes us forever. No matter if it's recent or long ago, no matter what the circumstances are. So my heart goes out to you for your loss. Regarding your question, how do I deal with the question of how did I lose my spouse? How did I lose my child? We often get this when somebody's being introduced to somebody at a social gathering and they say, tell me about your children, and a parent wonders, well, do I just talk about my children that are alive, or do I mention that I had another child who has passed away? And if I do I say, yeah, I have a child that passed away, but then what do I do if they continue pushing on with, well, how did they die? Because there's this innate human curiosity of, was it cancer? Was it a car accident? And the same is true in this situation where somebody might want to know what happened to your husband. I think there's a couple of things that you can do. First, you can simply say, yes, I lost my husband. It was a long time ago, and it was a really difficult circumstance, and I try not to talk about it too much. Really just kind of put it out there that you try not to talk about it. So you're acknowledging the loss, but you are giving a very clear indication to the person who's asking that you don't want to go into it. You can also say something like, yeah, I lost my husband. It was a long time ago. And it's still really hard and it's still really painful. So I tend to keep that, and I talk about it with these people, or I talk about it among family events or at holidays. What you're doing is you're framing around for yourself and for them how far they can go with it. If somebody is not willing to respect that boundary that you're putting up, you can simply say, I don't talk about how he died. Out of respect for my husband, I don't talk about how he died. I don't talk about what it was that took his life. I talk about the good things that I remember about him. But it's important for you to have mastery and control of that, not let somebody else have that. Because again, while it is human nature for people to be curious as to how or why somebody might have died under any circumstance, it's important for you to be able to control that and do it in the protection of your husband and your family. We had a situation several years ago where a big radio host, I won't say the person's name, had a big radio show, and a woman called in and said, my ex is in prison. I have the children, and he's in prison, and I just found out that he took his life in prison. And this woman said to the radio host, what do I tell my kids? Should I even tell them how he died? And the radio host said, no, No, don't ever tell your children how he died. And this mother was just kind of like really surprised and didn't know what to do about it, didn't think it was right. And then the host reached out to me afterwards, and she said, "Did I do the right thing?" And I said, "Well, the truth is that people will find out, and those kids are going to find out. And if somebody really wants to know, they're gonna get that information." And in this particular case, we want young people to know because we do know that it runs in families. We do want them to be prepared for things. But when it comes to a spouse like your situation that you bring up, and somebody asks, how did he die? I would simply say, you know what? I loved my husband, and it's been a long time, and I try to cherish and relish the memories that I have of him and let it be. So for you as well, my heart goes out to you for your loss of your daughter. And again, whether it was 2 months ago or 20 months ago or 10 years ago, this changes us and it changes our life. And we do find often, in terms of your question of how do I prevent her from being forgotten? How do I not make sure that her legacy continues? That is very common, because we do have a lot of people that believe that the life should just go on and that just the family remembers. So there's two things about this. One I'm going to say is going to be hard. I'm just saying that up front. And it's not just for you, for anybody who's watching this or listening. The other part I hope is not. The first part is that we know that suicide contagion is real. It's a real phenomenon. It doesn't happen a lot. It's about 1 to 3% of suicides, but it does happen. And the reason I bring that up is because when somebody dies, dies by suicide, there's this tendency and desire and want to have a memorial for the loved one that's gone. And they want it to be a big public memorial. They want to plant a tree, or they want to put a bench out or something like that. And the truth is that's not really a good idea to do in a public way. It's fine for a family to do that. Family can go get a brick at a park or plant a tree just amongst the family. But to make it a public event increases the risk that we're going to lose somebody else to suicide. The reason for that is that people feel as though they may get the same thing. And it's how they die by suicide, and they're going to get a tree too, when that tree may not come for them. So the hard part of the answer to the question about how do I remember them is not to do a public facing memorial, do a private facing memorial. It is true for your family and is a place where you can go to, and you can let people know, but just not make it a big publicized event. The other part of the how do you remember somebody is, I think, critically important to all of us. And it is, I think I say this for those that are not here. I believe they want us to talk about them. I believe they want us to remember them. I believe they want us to still have them in our lives. So whether that means at a holiday dinner, do we have a place for them? I think we should. Do we have a special candle out for them? I think we should. Do we talk about them? I think we should. Do I think that at other people's gatherings we bring them up? I think we should. I don't think that it is our job to just pay tribute to them when they've died and that we move on. They are still here and they're still with us. Now, they're not with us in the same way, but they are part of our heart. They're part of our lives. That scar I talked about, that is part of who we are now. And we can't avoid that, and we shouldn't avoid talking about that. But what we should do is, and I mentioned this earlier, not talk about how they died or that they died, but what they brought to us, what they've given in life. I think one of the greatest gifts that we can really share in life around grieving is to be able to put out there for the world those that we've lost their story and their legacy, and that we can live that for them. Doesn't mean we do it all day, every day. But in those moments where something feels like it is part of who we lost, even though we're seeing it right now, we say, that might be her. She used to do that too. She once said that to me too. We don't lose that, and we shouldn't lose that. We shouldn't lose that. I don't think we should ever forget someone we've lost for any reason, but especially from a death by suicide, because it reinforces stigma and shame, and it puts people at greater risk. We have to be able to acknowledge who they are and who they were in their life and what they've meant to us. So I don't think people are going to forget her. Clearly, you haven't forgotten her. And just by asking about this, it's her way of saying, don't forget me, Mom. So thank you for the question, which was really around a situation on a college campus and FERPA federal laws around right to privacy of students and what colleges or schools may or may not share with parents, and has it changed or at all? And the bottom line is yes, just a couple of years ago, there was a case in California that did go to the Supreme Court on foreseeability. And the case was around whether or not the university had a responsibility to foresee that a young person might engage in harming somebody else. And the Supreme Court actually did rule that there was foreseeability involved, and it was around a mental health issue. There was also another recent case in Pennsylvania, I believe it was, around duty to warn, and whether or not hospitals now have duty to warn even neighbors when they might be worried that something might happen to somebody around self-harm. So yes, there's been some changes around the country, and there are more and more places, states and at the federal level, looking at this issue around how do we help somebody who might be at risk of harming somebody else or harming themselves. Because we do know that keeping it quiet, keeping it silenced, does often result in a tragedy. Now, it doesn't mean it's universal yet. We still know that there are many schools that won't release this kind of information. And families are left out in a complete lurch. You know, the person is an adult by chronological age. But we do know that there's lots of conversation about this, and things are changing.
I try very hard whenever we have speakers to try to finish the sessions in a timely way, and often that means that you have to cut off questioners and not everyone gets their final question in because you want to finish on time. I feel like this subject is so important and sensitive and directly affects so many people who are part of this session that I'll ask you to bear with me while we take one or two more questions so we can finish up together and everybody's concerns have been addressed. So please bear with us. We won't go that much longer. I think you'll find, as the whole session has been, that the last few moments will be equally engaging and worthwhile. So Dr. Reidenberg, this is the question that was posed in the chat. Is mental health support different for depression for those who are facing insurmountable problems like terminal illness?
Is mental health issues and depression worse for those that are facing a facing a terminal illness? I don't know that to be true. What I can tell you is that when somebody is facing a terminal illness, they're facing life being out of their control and life ending, and that they're facing pain and agony and not wanting to have to go through that. That's the pain of a terminal illness, and it really does cause mental health challenges. It creates a lot of depression and anxiety for people. At the same time, those that are struggling with a mental health issue that don't have a terminal illness feel a lot of pain. They feel pain throughout their entire body. It really does affect them too. And oftentimes you hear people say, I just heard a woman speak about this just last week. And what she said is, I had cancer, I had a diabetes problem, I lost a kidney, I was in a car accident, and she had one other major physical ailment that had happened to her. And she said, I'll take all of that all over again versus my depression. And she did not have any terminal illness, terminal diagnosis. So I know that the pain that people feel when it comes to depression is real, whether it's a terminal illness or not. Pain of depression hurts and is profound. So I wouldn't say that it's worse. I would say, and sometimes it can be different, but in many ways it overlaps.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. And I'll ask the final question here, I guess, then. Unless Dr. Reidenberg, did anybody send you a question in the direct chat?
I don't know, because I haven't had it open.
Okay, if you'll just take a look at the chat just to see. I do have another question here.
There is one. Sorry, Rabbi. There's a question. How do you protect your children when they have guilt feelings for their father committing suicide after a patient sued him? We have to remind people that there is a lot of guilt that goes along with suicide. It is one of the common things among those that have been left behind, but it is very different from other kinds of death. We don't see that sense of guilt happening. But there really shouldn't be any guilt. When somebody has died by suicide, we know that there's a mental health issue, there's some biological, chemical issue, structural issue going on in the brain. And that child shouldn't feel anything towards their father other than love and admiration and miss and sorrow and grief. Whether there's a lawsuit involved or there's blame that somebody puts out for not having a barrier up or for not telling somebody soon enough, at the end of the day, it's not about how they died. It's the loss that we need to pay attention to. So it's hard to protect our children sometimes because legal things can get in the way. But the reality is that something was going on that ended up taking their life, and they should still love and honor and pay tribute to their father.
Thank you. I have another question here. I have a nephew with mental health issues. How does one deal with lack of resources in the community, the psychiatrist at the hospital not giving regular appointments, etc.? And I'll just say, as a footnote to that comment, that I just read in the newspaper today that in Ohio in particular, there is a severe problem with a shortage of therapists and mental health professionals. People can't get appointments. So this is a very real issue for us locally. What does someone do when there is a lack of resources and you know that there's a need?
This is a problem for us nationally and around the world, and it's going to be a bigger and bigger problem as we go forward, as we identify people and stigma goes away from mental health and people start seeking out help more. There's just not enough providers anywhere, even when things are good. But when things are bad during a pandemic or following a pandemic or other crises that happen, we don't have enough providers. We need an army of providers. We're looking at some new online technology kinds of resources for people. Not only are there things that there's mood monitors and things that people can get through social media and through technology, even through watches. There's many new online platforms that are being developed today, that are in existence today, that have bots that are able to provide some of the kinds of support and resources that we need. So technology, I think, is going to be an ever increasing and important factor in how we actually help people with this. And not everybody needs to be in a hospital. So while yes, we need more beds and we need more providers, we need more other kinds of solutions as well. There is the crisis text line, people being able to text, because that's a bigger need right now than even phone calling. So we have volunteers, tens of thousands of volunteers that are signing up to do more of that kind of response all the time. We have this problem a lot in remote areas, not just in this country, but around the world, where there's lack of access. That's where technology has got to come into play here, which follows me up on a question about what's the impact of social media and legalized marijuana on risk of suicide. I'll do those two quickly for you. With full transparency, I work for all the technology companies. I bring them all together all of the time to work on these issues. So with that, the impact of social media is both plus and minus. There's some really great things that technology allows us to do. If somebody's in crisis and they put that out on Facebook, very instantaneously, you will see lots of people support them. Technology can get people to resources in communities all over the world very, very quickly and save lives. Technology has a lot of great things that can help us, especially with artificial intelligence now, to early identify somebody before there might be a crisis. We're even working in the gaming community now, where people playing games online can be identified being crisis. There's some pluses. There's some challenges with technology as well. Obviously, there's bad things that can happen online. There's bad things that are put out online. The over identification and comparison issues online, how much people are spending on time online, all of those things are part of the balance that we need to deal with. But social media has both pluses and minuses to it. And finally, relative to legalized marijuana and suicide risk, we haven't seen a lot of great data on increased risk of suicide because of marijuana. We've seen young people who use marijuana in great extreme amounts and for long periods of time can have long-term effects around their mental health. It can actually lead to schizophrenia and other mental illnesses. But we haven't seen a lot of real good information around death by suicide because of that. So we've seen some changes over time in how people are using marijuana, medical marijuana, and even other CBD products with really positive outcomes, especially in Israel. There's a lot of use of CBD for issues like this.
There is one last question in the chat, which I think I'll answer just a brief response and encourage discussion after the program. Someone posted that they had gone through a friend who had died from suicide and felt like they didn't have a way to mark their grief Jewishly because they weren't a mourner. I think in some ways this is like other people who are close to somebody but not the direct mourner and are experiencing grief. In some ways it's also different and unique. I would just say two things about that. One is that, as I often tell people who are close to someone who passed away, who are not the direct mourner, you don't have to be the first-degree mourner in order to engage in mourning practices. The mourning practices are stipulated for the first-degree mourner, but anybody who is grieving and finds them helpful should engage in those practices as a way of marking their grieving and processing it spiritually and emotionally. It's perfectly okay and appropriate to do. Sometimes maybe that's awkward if the family doesn't want that to be the case. And so that maybe needs to be kind of worked through differently. And that may be especially the case sometimes in the case of suicide. And I would just say that if you find yourself in a situation where you have somebody that you knew who died by suicide and you are struggling with your own grief and emotions and how to process them, I would really encourage you to reach out to myself, to Rabbi Rudel Nuria. If you're from our congregation, if there are people here from other communities, to reach out to your rabbis and to speak to them. I think every case is different, so I can't give you like a prescription for a formula. I would say that we're all here, the rabbis, both at our synagogue and the community, to help guide you through processing that grief and finding a way to mark it and to deal with it. So please do, if you find yourself in that situation, reach out to us. I will just close with one last question, if I can. Dr. Reidenberg, out of the many things you shared with us, you talked about ways the synagogue can engage, and there were many good ideas that I hope that we will follow up on, but I was hoping that maybe we could end by you addressing one idea that you raised that really intrigued me, but I'm curious to you flesh it out for us a little bit what it means, which is you talked about holding an annual day of hope. I like that idea, but I'm not sure what that vision looks like to you. It sounds like something which you or others have done before, or maybe it's the vision of something you think would be a good thing to do. Share with us your thoughts about what an annual day of hope would look like.
Well, thank you. It is something that I've thought of. I've talked to many people about, and everybody tends to shape it their own way. In truth, sometimes it is around engaging youth and asking youth, "What is hope to you?" And having them write it out or draw it out, and then sharing it amongst the congregation. Because youth tend to not have all of the same kinds of experiences that all of us do as adults. They aren't quite as jaded and shaded. So they provide these wonderful, brilliant insights for us that can give us hope and inspiration. Sometimes people will look at it as reaching out to those that have been through a crisis before and asking them to be reflective on where did they find hope? How did they get through those difficult times? What provided them hope? Because that can give others tips and ideas on how to help somebody else when they are struggling as well. So there's a lot of different ways to look at this idea of an annual day of hope. But I think that the basic thrust of the concept is that hope is eternal. Hope is something that lasts forever for all of us, and we all find it in different ways. It's just when things are really hard for us, we can't see it. We need to rely on others that have it to be able to share it and feel it ourselves. And so when we can, as a congregation, say, hope is important, hope has value, hope has meaning, and we put it out there to our group, and we say, we believe in this concept of hope. Others that are struggling can kind of band behind it. And where they were hurting, they can find that hope. So that's really what it is for me.
That was a really beautiful response and is food for thought for us. I think that for us to do something along those lines would be really very meaningful for all of us. So I'm grateful that you raised that. I would have never thought of that idea. It really is very beautiful. Dr. Reidenberg, we are so grateful for your time this afternoon and for your wisdom and your guidance to us, all of us who have been touched in one way or another by this terrible struggle and tragedy of suicide in our communities, in our families. We've learned a lot from you. I think we've been inspired and comforted by you. You did at a few points along the way indicate to us in passing that you yourself were a survivor of suicide who suffered a loss. And so I want to, on behalf of all of us, express our condolences to you and our love and support to you. And we hope that God sends you comfort and helps you to hold on to your memories of your loved one, that they should be meaningful. And as you said, still live with you even now. And I do hope that we will have the opportunity down the road, maybe to bring you into our community, to do some workshops in person. It's clear to me there is a lot more for us to learn from you. And I'm very grateful and feel very blessed that we made this connection. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for your leadership. There are not many in the clergy that will do this and that want to take the step and the chance to open up a conversation. So I'm honored that you've done so, that you've brought people together. Thankful to you, the entire synagogue, and to the sponsors who've made it possible. It isn't easy to do this, and people often find risk in doing it. I hope that out of today, some people find comfort and solace and support. I hope that some people found information and enlightenment and some things that they can do to continue on this journey that we are all on in dealing with life, that can present to us some of the most difficult things when somebody is contemplating taking their own life. It just is beyond imagination, and yet something that if we don't know anything about, it isn't just going to go away. It's not going to get better unless we talk about it. So I appreciate you bringing this up and allowing me the chance to share, and I hope that others felt good about their use of the time today.